role. And the other procedural aspect that I wanted to just make sure before we kicked off the first topic was there any other items that folks wanted to make sure was added to this agenda or as a follow-up agenda for another governance call? All right. Okay. So I thought it might be helpful to actually just kind of frame this first agenda item kind of really quickly. So effectively, when we started to go through kind of in that spring period, go through kind of our governance processes and determine, how do we move forward as a community around our profiling and our governance processes as we see more and more emerge in the space to develop a CA core. And the two large takeaways that we had first for the profiling session was, to keep trying to incorporate processes and changes that make our content more leverageable. So it makes it easier for initiatives like the CA core to use. And the second big takeaway from the governance perspective was, to review any materials that came forward and to try to, have a channel for the CA baseline to provide questions or ask for clarity or feedback or considerations as we hear more and more about, how the initiatives are forming and how they're leveraging both grassroots and formal communities that exist. And so there was a presentation, I think it was about mid-April, and it was originally on the HL7 Canada community call around the interoperability roadmap and CA core, kind of the work that was going to be kicking off and the processes for alignment with the communities in between CHI and InfoA. So that was recorded, and we can put the recording, I think, in the chat. I don't know, Joni, if you're on, but I've got the URL if we need it. And then shortly after some of the comments that came out, I re-listened to it very, very recently. Some of the questions that arose from that call were specifically around kind of governance and how the governance model would operate for the larger interoperability roadmap. So as a follow-up, Joni was able to post the governance kind of approach, that high-level governance approach on the InfoCentral forums following that call to kind of fully resolve the question. And so that's kind of triggers our process of having this additional material that we can review and, provide more asks for clarity on. So the one thing I do in just kind of framing this, because we've done reviews like this a little bit before, is just that the way that we typically will communicate back as a informal community is, effectively we'll take our perspectives that we collect today and share them through that contact us channel that was requested in the thread itself. And then effectively, I think it's going to be important to stay, I know many of us wear many hats, but when we are providing questions or feedback from a CA baseline perspective, they've got to be kind of rooted in the CA baseline experience. And so I think those are the two kind of housekeeping items to help catch folks up that may not have been on the calls in that April timeframe. So what I wanted to do is kind of basically split frame, and so that we can review the content both from that governance approach and capture kind of in a structured format questions that we have, feedback, ask for clarity at the same time. So for folks who are interested in that kind of continuity, I'll put the forum, and this will have the links to the materials so you can follow along as well. Let me see. And the other, and this is a link within it, but you can find the YouTube from that presentation where I think some of the concepts today were starting to be mentioned at that YouTube link that I've just posted in the chat. So from this kind of forum thread, I'm just going to open up the interoperability roadmap governance, and I'm going to view it online. Okay. We'll see if I can split my screen. I'm going to do it like this. bear with me. Just, it's always hard to like to try to be recording the feedback and having something for review at the same time. So is that big enough for folks? I can also kind of maybe shift this over a little if we want a little bit more space.
Sure, if it helps, I'm like ready to describe if it helps just to have the main thing up.
Okay. So so that's the context that we have, which is you know, that preliminary documentation around the types of kind of governance bodies that were imagined to be put forward for the larger interoperability roadmap and its governance. And, you know, from the perspective here, you know, we can kind of infer some components about kind of established stakeholder working groups. But for the most part, you know, the CA baseline isn't called out specifically. So we don't really have a place to react to, oh, it's placed incorrectly or it is placed correctly. But I just want to, you know, I'm not the author of this content and I want to give folks the chance to kind of effectively review it. But what I would summarize this as is like, you have advisory bodies that Abby specifically kind of had called out in his presentation. One of the examples was, you know, the HL7 Canada community, as well as kind of more formalized councils and roles and tables that kind of split the strategic and the more operational initiative kind of levels that we see here. I would anticipate that the CA baseline, my interpretation of this would fall in this kind of stakeholder engagement, because it's not a formal group that it's not like HL7 Canada in that sense, right? We're a grassroots group that meets under FHIR implementers, but that when I see kind of these lines of communication going back and forth between the initiatives, that's my interpretation, is that we are a group of stakeholders that will have our kind of communication at the more operational level here, which makes sense as we represent, I think, the teams largely that are more operational in the jurisdictions working in FHIR and working in interoperability projects. But that's just my interpretation. I'm curious if there were other kind of questions or ask for clarity that the group that we want to put forward to aid in the review.
Well, the other place that it could fit in there is working groups, and I'm not sure how to differentiate between if we live at the stakeholder engagement level, or if we're a kind of working group, because you could also argue that we're an time dependent initiative based group. Like I'm not really sure. This is what I'm saying out loud here. It's not clear to me which place we fall. It is interesting to me that HL7 Canada isn't explicitly called out on this diagram.
Well, I do think that the verbal was helpful. Actually, I went back and I listened. While this wasn't like reviewed on that call for the roadmap that's on the YouTube, one of the things that Abby does say is kind of advisory bodies of the HL7 Canada community. So, you know, I think one of the bigger asks for clarity that we can put forward is just like, what are the definitions and how does the CA baseline, like, is it noted as an example under one of these kind of groups? Because I don't think HL7 FHIR baseline is an advisory body because we're not a formal operating body. But that's my interpretation.
Agree. We're someplace down on the bottom.
Is that how others are kind of seeing this as well?
I would agree. We are somewhere down at the bottom. Where, I'm not sure, but I don't think we're working groups. I don't know that we're initiative-based groups either, because that sounds like something that they kick off for a particular purpose. I think we're stakeholder.
And I think Elliot, is your comment like the WHIR, the identity tied to WHIR stakeholder being like the CFIR baseline? Because I know we also have folks who probably will be involved in initiatives and working groups by merit of working with the jurisdictions.
Yeah,
But that is like a separate role then under the guise of the CFIR baseline.
Is this working group is not directing that there is many groups underneath, like digital health is showing one, and initiative-based group, and there is so many layers they're presenting into this one. Maybe we fall somewhere there.
So that's an ask for clarity, Mukesh.
Yes, I think so. Yeah.
I mean, I thought of the working groups as things like the terminology work group and the GSSO work group and things that are sort of, and even maybe the FHIR implementers work group that we're under, as that's those relatively permanent groups is what I thought went over there in the working groups. I note in our
existing groups.
Yeah, I note that, I mean, if we look on Info Central and look for communities, we have two different kinds of communities or work groups there. There's the ones like terminology, and then there's if you look at the menu, there's sub teams under things like FHIR implementers, etc. So we already are differentiating somewhat between those kinds of groups in the existing structure.
And so is the ask like, how will both of those types of types, is it community and working groups fall into this?
Mm-hmm.
Because for us, like, we're, like you said, like FHIR implementers is a working group. We have these streams for our work, but in the same way, Smart North, which deals with Smart on FHIR guidance, is also kind of one of those FHIR implementation working groups.
You see in this, I don't know if we have more details. If you see on extreme left, it says on the top it is strategy. Then the working groups falls under initiatives over here. So they might have more. And yes, into the main presentation or somewhere, or this only two, strategic and initiative.
One of the things that I see in this is this use of a dotted line and the placement of like not a formal governance group. And so like in some ways, to me, I interpret that to mean like the working group in its distinctness from stakeholder engagement is probably more formal. So it's likely to be like a newly established group to achieve a certain means that is different than like I would anticipate something like patient summary would be like an initiative. So to me, that's what drove my interpretation of we're probably going to be more of the stakeholder engagement, because we aren't a formal governance body. We're not a formal
anything.
Yeah. And so is this really where our two questions lie, which is just like, are there definitions that help us understand, can we confirm our placement as stakeholders in the stakeholder engagement bucket? And, how do we interpret some of like the visual layering that we're seeing here?
Even I see the stakeholder engagement has a dotted line with on the top. So means all these working groups under working groups have a connection with stakeholders engagement, means whether it is an initiative-based group or any other group. These dotted lines means they have a connection with stakeholders to connect and make the approach or how we want to do, how we want to initiate, how we want to move forward kind of thing, which I think all are doing. So I see we are more somewhere under the working group. That is my thought from this approach.
Well, periodically we get questions, like particularly, I think the last time it happened was on a profile call. Someone, as we're walking through and talking about the discussions, someone asks, does this have the authority of a Canadian requirement, right? But we don't really have any authority. We have collaborative, consensus-based, this is what we're putting forward. So the question around who decides those kinds of matters is one that periodically comes up. And people ask it on the calls periodically.
And so, like, Lorraine, are you like inferring that while it's not necessarily like a formal function, part of our kind of role might be in making sure that the folks who ask those types of questions are kind of shifted to if there's an established working group for that category of question?
Well, yeah, and I don't think there is one yet. I mean, maybe once this gets stood up, there will be, but I don't think there is one yet. So we're working on consensus, which is, I guess, why, to Elliot's point, why stakeholder does maybe make sense.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think even if we had a formal process from FHIR and InfoWay's point of view, I don't think we are one of their working groups. I don't think we're one of their initiative-based groups. From their point of view, we are a stakeholder, or we represent stakeholders. And that actually might be interesting. Are we a stakeholder, or do we represent stakeholders and they might go around us? Yeah, I think the only place we could fit in here, if we look at this from FHIR and InfoWay's point of view, is a stakeholder.
I think maybe you're right, because if we see the reporting and that headline, it doesn't connect to the stakeholder, but connect to the groups. And because I don't know if we are reporting to anyone, no, because this red line, the flow and the governance piece, doesn't connect to the stakeholders engagement. So basically, we are providing information of these groups to a group, and they report to the senior leadership.
Yeah, I think it's going to be probably a nuanced answer to Elliot, your question, because like I know Shannon has reached out and asked, like, you know, can you help us with the list of who's been engaged in the last few years in the CA FHIR baseline, so we can make sure that, you know, we're engaging folks from that perspective. And so to me, that means like you are, whether or not the question is raised on a CA FHIR baseline call, or it's a question raised about the perspective on the CA FHIR baseline from the representatives that are active in these groups, you know, I think that makes the answer, that answer could be interpreted either way. But I think the most important thing that we should be looking for is both our perspectives as Canadian FHIR implementers engaged, and is the perspective of the CA FHIR baseline engaged, regardless of the channel in which it comes through. Like if for instance, you know, Randy, Elliot, Thomas, like if you were asked, you know, from the CA FHIR baseline perspective as participants to weigh in on something, I think it's the rooting of it in that context that is probably more important. But I mean, I think that's up to us to say, do we think that there is something meaningful for us to be able to put forward? No, it makes sense to try to engage us like on this call while we're as collectively together.
Well, and while looking at this org chart, effectively, um, the reporting goes up through the digital health and data interoperability coordinating table, which isn't marked as new here. To be honest, I'm not familiar with that.
So that was, I know from our work in patient summary that the coordinating table was an established structure that covered the work under patient summary and some of the other initiatives that were being worked on, like the Canadian Fire Exchange specification.
Is that a open group or is it closed group?
I think it's jurisdictional participants. So I think it is based on the subset of folks actively representing certain roles and jurisdictions.
Mm-hmm. Because it sort of looks here like if we're stakeholder engagement, it looks like we're sort of filtered through the initiatives. If you know what I mean, just the way it's drawn.
Oh, you mean instead of being like multiple boxes?
Like, yeah, because because we're more long-term than the initiatives are. The initiatives are basically projects, right? But our connection through to the coordinating table is through the initiatives. There's no direct connection there.
I think that makes sense though, because what from a CFIR baseline perspective, like we're weighing in on the baseline in the context of an initiative, but not into like the strategic operational components of adoption of said initiative. That's like outside of our scope.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, it probably makes sense, but I think it does highlight sort of where we would be consulted, and that if it's through the initiatives and through specific working groups, although perhaps it's the working groups connection that would be more long-term. But it seems like it's asking advice piecemeal rather than longer term or more comprehensively. Is that what you're sort of getting at, Lorraine?
Yeah, and it was just an observation based on how this is sort of structured about,
Yeah,
because it implies what, in some ways, how InfoWave views us, right?
absolutely.
So is this like a question? Like, how do we see it being engaged? Like, kind of ad hoc as needed versus procedurally?
Mm-hmm. And in some ways, it was an observation to confirm my understanding of what I was looking at.
Are there any other questions or, items for feedback? Actually, you know what? I want to actually probe that last piece procedurally. So let's say that the specifications produced through the initiatives meet the requirements coming out of the CFIR baseline and would continue to meet those requirements. How do we see the baseline being engaged procedurally, continuously once that bar is met and that bar is upheld?
Well, I think we'll get to a point where the bulk of the work is done, but I think there's still going to be an ongoing maintenance, respond to questions, respond to issues. And a new project comes in and they have a slightly different need and they log an issue. There's certainly, I think that's an ongoing task. And we sometimes forget once we've created all the profiles or whatever, once we've done the work, we forget about the ongoing maintenance.
So I'm gonna zoom in so you guys can actually see what I'm typing and tell me if this is kind of what you're thinking.
Hang on, I have to bring my screen back down to full size because I zoomed in.
So like from the perspective of, you know, as we get, and I put in change requests from the initiatives too, because like, let's say we've always said if something like if the CA core or another initiative were to identify challenges with requirements in the CA baseline, that first kind of rule of interaction is communicate them backwards so that we can incorporate that, review it, incorporate it as a change is appropriate. And so beyond just like change requests that come in from the community, I think this is probably also likely. And so do you think this is a fair summation of your question?
So it was more a statement than a question, but yeah. Because you asked whether we thought the baseline would be an ongoing work or would finish. And I think the maintenance won't finish. Some of the other work may.
Mm-hmm.
Maintenance shouldn't finish.
Yes. And I think in some respects, in some of our other items, we've dropped that ball a little bit. Not in the baseline, but I think that's somehow, in some respects, how we got to where we are with the URI registry right now.
Any other pieces of feedback or questions that we want to, because what I'll do, or corrections to what we're seeing here, before we kind of compile this and send it back through the standards channel. I'll zoom into this just a little bit more.
I was just reading the first sentence on your slide. I didn't think that was that crucial.
Well, we pull it, like we had it on the agenda for the 7th, and then we pulled it up, and we didn't have a ton of folks that were attending that week, and so we also noticed that you were out, so what we decided to was just to postpone it. Okay. Any others before we shift to the second topic of the agenda? All right. So the second topic of the agenda was specifically around our like what level of guidance should we be thinking through from our use of, for instance, in our notation of use of assets from the Canadian URI registry. Lorraine, I know we talked last week in the profiling stream about like, you know, some of the technical processes that went along with this, but you said that there was kind of a larger question around, you know, as a kind of utilizer, and I looked through the guide, and we do actually provide, beyond just having it in our patient profile as I think as a description, we do provide content, you know, in this section, and I'll put it in the chat as well, around JHNs that at the time were pulled from, or sorry, URIs that were pulled from the Canadian URI registry. And so kind of knowing the level of guidance where we've potentially also be contributing to this challenge of stale dating if these things change and they're hosted by an outside asset. But then also kind of, you know, minor information about utilization of values and version codes. Lori, and I think your question was, do we need to modify our guidance like in the profiles and the guidance like in these sections about what to put here, given some of the experiences that we've been having?
No, it was more around, well, the first one was, the technical one, for instance, many of the JHNs in the URI registry were still in authoring state, right? As for example. And so there's a separate thread going about that. The fact that we made the decision to create the URI registry so that there was one source of truth for naming systems, and the reason we use the naming system is that provides us some insulation against what happens with changes. So I think is all fine. I may have asked it in the wrong forum, because the question that was coming up was when we did OID registration, we had guidance about how granular of an OID you put in the registry, and what went in your own space and what went in other spaces. And so BC was struggling with figuring out how to do that as they're implementing FHIR interfaces against client registry. So in some ways, that's where some of the conversations came up. So we've got guidance on the URI registry about when and how to create a naming system in the Canadian registry. But we don't necessarily have guidance about how specific you should get. And this may not be the right forum for that, but it seemed like all the right people were here, and that's why I originally asked it. So what should be in a BC registry or an Alberta registry, an Ontario registry, and what should be in the national registry? Because the national registry actually has some very, very granular items, because it was, I believe, mostly created by importing material from the OID registry and then maintained going forward. And then the maintenance processes around that. So this very well may not be the right place to talk about that. I think, I just need to get closer here.
And zoom in as well.
Yeah.
Because I think the places where we have potential exposure for risk, if details in the Canadian URI registry change, or if authors are utilizing naming systems that are hosted elsewhere, is really just at the naming system level, because that's where we've exposed details.
Yes.
Here.
Yes, and as we get past patients and into providers, there's the naming system details to identify the various college identifiers and all those other things, right? And I don't know if we've referenced very much of that in
I can check. Yeah, let me see.
But as we start to build real systems, those things start to matter.
Okay, so identifiers. Okay, so a little bit of a call out here, but not in the same way we were actually to list them.
Oh yeah, there's too many to list here.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and this originally came up because the profiles that we created for patient, because they inherited from the CA baseline, and CA baseline, of course, uses the URIs that are in the Canadian URI registry appropriately. But one of the other systems was using what was in BC Core. And the question is, where should things be when we're doing a profile? So it sounds to me like, and we've pretty much talked through what we think we should do in terms of what should be provincially scoped, and what should be in the Canadian URI registry, potentially referenced from the baseline, in terms of how we're going to try to attack that. But I don't know if it's appropriate to provide any particular kind of guidance like we used to do with the OID registry. And if so, who should do that.
That we should have some guidance of some sort in there just to prevent issues that we encountered with the OID registry, like say, or mentioned before, that certain companies have gone and registered concepts that we've already had OIDs for and started using them and started trying to tell us we had to change to their OIDs.
Yes, I mean, and
So
we had a documented process for adding new OIDs, although not new naming spaces in the OID registration section. And when I looked at it last Monday, it said, you know, you send a note to the FHIR implementers in the HL7 Canada community and make sure that, you know, so people can identify when, you know, this already exists, et cetera, et cetera. That's been slightly modified when I looked at it later this week, because I was going to copy it for Joni. It took out the piece about notifying the lists. It just said to consult your jurisdictional SME. But I guess one of Sheraton's questions, is it the job of the baseline team to draft and provide that guidance? The FHIR implementers community call is only once a quarter. So
technically the implementers, whatever call it was that was doing that, is what's turned into this baseline
that's
call.
right.
Well,
Yeah, because it used to be the architecture call that was doing that stuff, and that turned into this call, particularly the governance call.
well, except that we did make actually a distinction and a decision to break off and have separate call-ins, separate agendas. Like we used to have a portion, like, and when I say it was like maybe the first month or two of the calls for the baseline, but we quickly shifted over to like having our own Zoom. So I don't think having started using the same Zoom link is merit for saying that that changes the scope of our responsibilities.
It's not so much the Zoom link, it's that the group of people involved in those calls are the same people that are here.
And we
Everybody
stopped.
that was in that call moved into this group.
Yeah, and we stopped doing the architecture calls. It folded into this, which was why it seemed like I should ask this question here. Even though it feels, I mean, it is part of our baseline infrastructure in terms of, well, maybe not.
I would say it's kind of like it's fundamental to that baseline. I mean, if we don't have a way of defining our URIs and stuff, then our baseline is going to be kind of pointless too.
So I meant foundational, not baseline, right?
Yeah.
Foundational infrastructure. And the question is foundational infrastructure something that the baseline team cares about or is responsible for? And if not, who is?
So I'm dealing with a similar kind of issue on a project I'm working on where we've got terminology that updates, and this is actually what HL7 International is dealing with. They've got terminology that updates at a different cadence than FHIR itself. And so they've broken it off into, well, if it was anyone other than HL7 International doing it, they've broken it off into a separate implementation guide. And so I wonder if what we're really talking about is separate from CA baseline, is there a need for a FHIR-friendly reflection of the OID registry?
Well, I thought that's what the URI registry was supposed to be.
Okay, so, but it does that fall into the CA baseline effort, or is that a, you know, whoever's managing the OID registry and therefore the URI registry, it's their responsibility to put in the processes necessary to gatekeep and maintain.
Well, it's not clear to me who that is.
So
Yeah.
as a naive person to the subject, just seeing the volley back and forth on the forums and hearing what has been discussed, what I've heard to date is that that's largely falling within the governance that was agreed upon by the jurisdictional inputters. Am I incorrect in that assumption?
I think the jurisdictional inputters, I think, are governing their processes, you know, or not, depending upon whether they're maintaining things. But
There was
in terms of the guidance and the decision making, I don't think that's happening.
the discussion way back when, like I say, when we found those problems with the OIDs, there was a big discussion with the whole group here of all the people who are participating at that time, and that's why we came up with the process that's been put there
Yes.
to do the deal with the OIDs. And then we decided basically use the same process for URIs because you would typically get both an OID and a URI at the same time for a concept.
Yes.
So there was no point in making two different processes do it the same way. And that's why it had in there to post to the FHIR implementation or FHIR, whatever the group was called at that point, plus the HL7 one, so that you would make sure that you hit anybody who's using just an OID or just a URI.
Yes. And there's that Google Doc that's linked from the URI registry that Lloyd originally wrote, but that was sort of pre-decision making pieces about policies about what should go where. There was a policy around OID registration about how, whether you created something that went into the OID registry or whether you just kept it yourself in a jurisdictional list.
Realistically, I don't see that kind of stuff's changed because you're doing essentially the same thing. It's just, are you calling it an OID or are you calling it a URI? You
are, but I can't find that policy anywhere. Right? There's nothing linked off the URI registry in terms of the guidance. And we got into this because, I mean, when BC was doing the BC core work, that was like 3 years ago, and everybody was trying to figure in BC was trying to figure out what went where. So we got duplicates in both projects that were sometimes inconsistent, which is one of the problems that happened with the OID registry. If we didn't have a review process, then we get the problems that you pointed out. I went way back in the forum to when the URI registry was being created, and Randy, you posted, I think, some fairly clear guidance in terms of what you saw the decision-making process was, but it's buried, you know, in the forum from the days when the URI registry was created.
I thought there was a version of that stuff put into the concepts as that evolved, put into the documentation there, but I'd have to go look and see.
I feel like a lot of what we're talking about are symptoms of non-formal governance, right? And so if it was tackled in a forum here and there, if it was tackled as a subtopic on a call because we were all together, but it was never really something that, you know, was ever the responsibility of one group or another. I don't think the question of should this become the responsibility of a group that doesn't have formal governance or another type of group that we could spin up on the forums that has a similar challenge, like, I don't think it's going to get solved that way. And so I think maybe the better way of addressing this problem isn't to debate the merit of, is this a baseline responsibility? It's if the folks that are on this call that experience these impacts desire it enough, is this not something that we could ask for, like the utilization of assets as one of those working groups that we saw on the governance approach in the first half of the hour that would have formal governance and hold itself to documentation expectations?
Yeah, well, one of the things I was going to say is it might be the role of the baseline group to say we've identified a problem and kick it upstairs.
Mhm.
That would probably be fair, because I think really what should be done is you have a dedicated group that's doing it, that, you know, that's been determined, and we actually get it documented, say this is where it is. Because right now it's just sort of lying in the fringes of whoever picks it up.
Exactly. I think so.
And we're
Mhm.
just talking about the URI registry, right?
Right
Well,
now,
Well, I would say you got to talk about URI and OID registry as one concept. They have to stay together. You do not want them separated.
Okay. Because basically the way that I would say, like the amount that I think we can kick it up the line is to put forward, if we're saying, hey, this is something that we want more formal governance of, just to say as part of our review, this was a challenge that has been raised by folks who are participants in the CA baseline that we think might be a good fit for being solved by this model. And to identify URI and OID registry is the pain point as one of the potential pain points that would fit into that request. Does that seem fair?
yeah, and I think one of the other things may be to clarify for the jurisdictional SMEs, you know, what their role is in maintenance on the material that's there. Because one of the things that did happen was because of the change in when Simplifier brought in status values more granularly, I think that sort of affected a bunch of what's in there. But it may be very well be that nobody was actually looking at it.
Yeah, I think definitely the call to action for anyone who's involved in this off of the forum discussions this week is look at what's in the URI registry for your jurisdiction, ensure it matches with your expectations, and follow the processes that have been discussed today for corrections. But you know, I empathize with Joni in her position of, you've got a request from a jurisdiction to publish this, and we have to publish it at some point in time, and folks need to look at the content that they're actively responsible for managing. So if your jurisdiction has not performed that review, please do so. But I think it's something that, you know, it's really hard when you hear from one jurisdiction that they desire something and another that desires something that requires it.
Yeah, well, and I guess it depends for Ontario, so I think Ontario is one who asked for it to be published, right?
I think it was
it depends upon their purposes. If they're okay with knowing that the current state needs some maintenance, maybe the appropriate thing is to go ahead and publish it, and maybe we have to publish it again after a maintenance period.
Yeah, but if you have an opinion on that, do go to the forum post that I think that was through HL7 Canada and the FHIR implementers, correct?
A question I got was, what does publish mean in this context?
Yeah, I was wondering the same thing.
So I talked to Joni a little bit about it. We anticipated it's developing a package off of the contents that wouldn't, unless you're going in manually changing the statuses, it wouldn't change the statuses of the content. It would just take what is in the URI registry to date. So it's a FHIR package of that content.
Yeah, so many of the URIs are in the state of published, but lots of them aren't, and there's a few mistakes. So if she publishes a packet, does that then change? That doesn't change the state of the items that are currently in authoring or draft state?
It hasn't previously when we went through the process of packaging naming systems.
Perhaps I'm missing a little bit of understanding. Like, what do you mean by publish, like packaging or whatever? You're just putting a tag on these things to say this is a current setter or something?
So remember how when we packaged for the CA baseline, we effectively created a point in time set of files for what the structure definitions and extensions said at the time. And then that got basically put together in a package that is then available in a registry. So folks who are wanting to say, I have a dependency on, in this case, the Canadian URA registry, the tools know to look up, okay, what's in the package for the version that they desire.
Okay, then that brings on the next question. So I've got like 40 or 50 more I'm going to be adding in the near future. If you publish today, when would those ones get into the package?
I think it depend, like for us, we had to make determinations around like how frequently we wanted to package our set of artifacts. I think that same decision would be need to made for the Canadian URI registry. Otherwise, my guess is it would be by request.
So
And
that's,
then
maybe
see-
that's some of the formal rules we got to get put
Yeah.
in there. It's
Yeah.
just, how's that going to happen?
And then the same question is, who do you actually make the request of? I mean, Joni probably got the request because everybody knows Joni does most of the work, but that may not be, as we start adding more things, particularly as we're going through patient registry and provider registry, it may not be fair to be directly pinging Joni in all of these requests.
You mean on the packaging requests?
Yeah.
And is there a value in saying we have a annual or semi-annual release and you can pin yourself to the 2023
Mm-hmm.
release?
Yes, just like we do with Loink, right?
Mhm.
So then what happens in between?
That's up for you guys to decide. Like ultimately, right? Like these are all questions that need formalized rules decided, but like there's no one in the sky that's saying it has to be this way. It's just based on what you need as users to make a recommendation and ask for it to look that way.
The way I'm seeing it is with these kind of things, with the URIs and OIDs, they don't happen very often, but when somebody needs one, they can't be waiting 6 months for it to be active either, right? That's kind of where that question mark comes in.
I know that's a question that we had to deal with on the profiling side of things. And so one of the considerations that we had was to just say, based on having very little volunteers, to try to keep it at major and minor releases, because, patchwork goes in from time to time, but when it's a volunteer effort, it's really hard to package every time you make a GitHub pull request consumed into the project. So it's probably going to be dependent on the type of volunteer and non-volunteer resourcing that's available.
That kind of almost indicates to me that
Mm.
probably packaging shouldn't be being done for this stuff then. Because it's going to become certain persons designated and they're either going to get tied up regularly with these things when they don't know what's coming and stuff, or else.
Packaging is really useful when you're trying to write the implementation guides that reference it, particularly if you're going at it from the point of view of using FHIR shorthand, etc.
Yeah, so what I would, if we look at the rest of the FHIR ecosystem, yes, there are official publications, and whether that's a DSTU or whether that's actually a release, and you can put your dependencies on that, and those are rather controlled releases, very controlled releases. But you've also got access to the continuous integration build. And so if you want to see something that is probably what is coming, that's a good place to look. So if you want to pre-adopt, if we use V2 terminology, if you want to pre-adopt a naming system, you can have a dependency on the continuous integration build and get access to it that way. On the other hand, it probably makes sense to wait, and that's good for while you're doing your own local development. But you probably want to pin yourself to a released version when that content actually does get released.
Yeah, I mean, some of what started this was that well, there's some things you can see are sort of in draft mode. We sort of thought that the JHNs across the country were something that should have been defined and stable by now.
Yeah, yes.
So are we comfortable? Is anyone not in agreement that it's probably, the development of what those rules look like is probably not content that would be in the scope of what the CA baseline produces, but that we can facilitate the request for, spaces where these can be decided and have more formal governance in the requests for more clarity and feedback that we're providing through the contact us page.
Sounds good.
Okay. All right, then I am going to stop the recording. I will get that recording up on our YouTube later.